In this video, we want to touch on a little bit of an advanced feature you can start to add to your endpoints called data modeling. The reasons you might use data modeling, we're going to cover in this video as well. And then we're going to give you an example of how we set up data modeling on just a very simple provider map, just to give you an idea of what goes on. One of the reasons you might want to add a model to your endpoint is because there's data attached to a particular endpoint on the data provider that has fields you're just not interested in. So if you're pulling in data into, for instance, a phone app, some of this extra data can take up a lot of memory that you might want to save for processing power and other such things. So what you can do using the BitScoop API Toolbox is just filter this data at the source and get rid of it if you're not interested in it on an application level. You also might come across data that is of a questionable format, as we say. So for instance, you might have seen here an ID or a count, something that should be an integer, that it's not serialized as an integer. So how do you deal with this? Well, normally what you do is you take the data into your application and then parse the data. But using the BitScoop API Toolbox, you can do this at the source as well. So the data that you get into your application can be a lot cleaner than you would get directly from the data provider. You also might encounter things that aren't necessarily bad data formats, but something like a email field. If you want to parse an email as an actual email object and not a string, we're going to show that a little bit later, or parse a date into a particular format, so on and so forth. So using the BitScoop API Toolbox, you can do a lot of these things. Another reason you might want to do data modeling on an endpoint is because the data itself has inherent relationships that you need to start to describe. So you can see here that this very simple data, the one on the left has a user ID, and the one on the right has an ID. The one on the right is presumably a user that is related to the data on the left. Well, we're not going to cover relationships in this video in particular. We've got a later video for that. We just wanted to bring up one of the reasons you would use data modeling for that use case so that you get a general idea and start to get thinking about it. Now that we covered some of the motivations for why we might want to do data modeling, we wanted to show you exactly how you would implement data modeling on an endpoint in the BitScoop API Toolbox. So we have our sample data provider here that we've already set up just to save some time. So we're going to dive right into that and look into the source code. And you can see here, if you're familiar with some of our other videos and resources, we already have a provider with some endpoints. So this endpoint post is going to map to the resource posts on our sample data provider that we're going to be running on localhost 5858. And then this endpoint users maps to the resource users on the data provider that we're running. So you can see here that we don't have any model specifications. So we just want to give you an idea of what the data is going to be returned back without a model. So over on the right-hand side of the screen here, we have our local data provider running. And over on the left-hand side, we've set up some Postman collections and pre-populated them with some requests so we can see the data that comes back. So we're going to grab a single post with an ID of 1. Let's go ahead and send that. And you can see the data that's available here is the user ID, the title, and the body. Very straightforward data. It's nothing too complicated about that. And now we're going to request a single user with an ID of 1. And we get back again some more filler data. Some of this stuff we might not care about. So let's go ahead and add some models to both of those endpoints and see how things change. So I've popped over onto my other screen and I'm going to grab the model here just to save some time again. And we're going to add it to posts. And what you see in this model specification is the key. That's a required field. It has implications for related fields and drawing relationships. But essentially what it says is that the model assigned to this post endpoint is going to be identified by the value ID. So this ID here matches that field ID there. The fields that we're going to be interested in actually returning are the ID, which we're going to say is an integer, the user ID, which we're also going to say is an integer, and the title, which we're going to say is a string. Notice we do not have the body. So what we'd expect to see is that the body is not returned from our call. So let's save this, and remember that updates dynamically. And now we're going to call that single post again and see what we get. So you can see here the body is not there, so we've successfully filtered that field that we don't care about. So let's hop back over one more time. Let's take a look at this source code again, and we're going to add a model to the user's endpoint. And again, I've already set that up for you all. So we just have to grab it from our screen here and add it right in. And you can see here the specification is very similar. Again, this user model is identified by the ID, and the ID is an integer. Some of the other fields that we care about are the name, which we're just going to parse as a raw string. And then the email, remember we talked about this before, the email we're actually going to parse as an email object and not as a string. We could parse it as a string, but what we're interested in is perhaps the name associated with the email address and the actual email address itself. So we're going to save this, and it's updated already. And we go to the user instance, and we go ahead and send that request. And so you can see here that some of the same features are visible there. So we filtered a lot of the fields, the ones we didn't specify that we cared about. We have the ID, we have the name, and then we have the email address that's been broken up, parsed as an email, into the name, totally real name, and the email address right here. So that about wraps up what we had in store for data modeling. We're going to also be touching on relationships and how you establish those relationships between various endpoints in a later video. As always, feel free to check out our GitHub repository for some examples if you learn from real-world examples like we do. Aside from that, thanks so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.